when a pair of trail runners discovered the decomposing corpses of Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters buried under sticks and leaves in Belangolo State Forest on September 19, 1992, it was only the beginning of what would eventually result in the capture of Australia's most famed serial killer. Over the next month, searchers would discover 5 more bodies stowed away in the woods of the park, ending the mystery of the disappearances of foot travelers in the area. The bodies discovered by the runners were identified as Clark and Walters, both of whom were British and traveling together on foot. They had last been seen over 5 months before. Soon the remains of hitchhikers James Gibson and Deborah Everlist, last seen near the forest in 1989, were found. Almost a month later, Simone Schmidl, a hitchhiker who disappeared in January of 1991, was discovered under the now familiar pile of brush. When a pair of jeans found near Schmidl's body were found to be the property of yet another missing person, the searching continued. Predictably, the jeans owner, German Anja Habschied, and her boyfriend Gabor Norgebauer were found nearby dead. The young couple had been missing since December of 1991. Aside from the obvious similarities between the way all the victims had disappeared and been disposed of, their causes of death were a bit dissimilar. Clark had been stabbed in the chest area, Clark had been stabbed and shot in the head several times, Gibson had been repeatedly stabbed, Everest had been slashed in the face in addition to her stab wounds. Schmidl had also been stabbed, Habschied was decapitated, and Norgebauer had been shot in the head 5 times with the same weapon that killed Walters. The stabbing victims all had a unique injury, though, a stab wound to the upper back that severed the victim's spinal cord and rendered them helpless. Also, many of the victims were partially undressed with their pants buttoned but not zipped. Evidence of crude bondage and strangulation was present in most of the cases. Authorities were stumped by the case until 1993, when a man named Paul Onions identified Ivan Milat as the person who attacked him after picking onions up near the forest 3 years before. Milat and his brother Richard were already suspects in the killings, though police knew that Richard had been at work on the days of the abductions. Ivan Milat was soon charged with Onion's assault and all 7 murders. Faced with some very damning evidence at trial, Milat feebly tried to explain on the stand that he was the victim of an elaborate setup perpetrated by his own family. Predictably, he was found guilty on all counts on July 27, 1995, and sentenced to prison for life. Milat has stated plans to escape at every OPOR unity, but thus far has not made good on the threat. He has, however, attempted to kill himself at least twice after swallowing such materials as razor blades and staples. In June of 2001, Milat appeared at an inquest into the deaths of 3 women in 1978 and 1979. Robin Hickey, 17, Amanda Robinson, 14, and Leanne Goodall, 20, all disappeared from an area north of Sydney under similar circumstances as Milat's known victims. Though Milat attended the inquest, he offered nothing to help investigators and denied having known the women or ever having picked up a hitchhiker in that area. Australia's worst serial killer of modern times, Ivan Milat was the son of Croat immigrants, born in 1945. A non-smoker who also shunned liquor, Milat worked as a highway construction worker and devoted his leisure time to motorcycle riding, off-road touring in a 4-wheel drive vehicle, and hunting. Friends assumed that his passion for stalking game was restricted to 4-legged targets, but they were mistaken. Today, Milat stands convicted of 7 murders committed between 1989 and 1992 and suspected of more dating back to the late 1970s. Australia's 2-year manhunt for the vicious backpack killer began in September 1992 when hikers found the decomposed remains of 2 women in the Belanglo State Forest, near Sydney, at a point called Executioner's Drop. The corpses were identified as 21-year-old Caroline Clark and 22-year-old Joanne Walters, British tourists last seen alive in Sydney on April 18, 1992, while thumbing rides to Adelaide. Autopsies revealed that both young women had been sexually assaulted. Walters had been gagged and stabbed to death, and Clark was shot 12 times in the head. The discovery of two corpses prompted a older search, and police soon found a shallow grave a few miles distant from the first site that contained the skeletal remains of Australians James Gibson and Deborah Everest. The two 19-year-olds had disappeared somewhere between Liverpool and Goulburn while hitchhiking to a conservation festival on December 9, 1989. Gibson's pack and camera were found beside a rural highway 2 months later, as if thrown from a passing car. The search continued. In October, authorities found the remains of 21-year-old Simone Schmidl, a German visitor who disappeared on the same stretch of road between Liverpool and Goulburn, hitchhiking to Melbourne on January 21, 1991. Her glasses and camping equipment had later been found in the brush near Wangata, a small town in Victoria. According to the medical examiner's report, Simone had been bound, gagged, and stabbed repeatedly. The corpses of two more German tourists, 21-year-old Gabor Norgebauer and 20-year-old Anya Habschied, were found on November 4, 1992. The couple had last been seen alive 10 months earlier, on December 26, 1991, when they set off hitchhiking FTOM King's Cross to Darwin and vanished without a trace. Their deaths bore all the signs of another sexual attack. Norgebauer was apparently strangled, then shot 6 times in the head. His girlfriend was nude below the waist and she had been decapitated, her head missing from the scene. By that time, Australian police knew they had a serial killer at large. Published photos of the victims brought calls pouring in from locals who had seen him hiking through the countryside or thumbing rides, but none apparently had seen the killer except, perhaps, for Paul Onions. A British subject from Birmingham, Onions heard about the backpack murders on television and recalled his own near miss with death outside Sydney in January 1990. Onions had BCEN thumbing rides when he was picked up by the driver of a silver Nissan 4-wheel drive truck, who introduced himself as Bill. A half-mile north of the Belanglo State Forest, Bill had stopped and pulled a gun, declaring, "This is a robbery." Onions had run for his life through the bush, bullets whizzing past his head, and managed to escape after a hectic chase. He recalled the gunman well enough to help police prepare a sketch, including the would-be killer's handlebar moustache. Investigators, meanwhile, were reviewing their files on old sex crimes, including a December 1974 rape allegation filed against Ivan Milat, known to use the nickname Bill. On May 22, 1994, a flying squad of 50 officers raided the property in Eagle Vale, a Sydney suburb, where Milat lived with a girlfriend. The raiders caught their man in bed, and a search of his home turned up evidence including firearms linked to the murders and camping gear stolen from the victims. A sword, reportedly used to behead Anya Habschied, was found in a later search at the home of Milat's mother. Detectives suggested that Milat sometimes killed his victims and then used their skulls for target practice after they were dead, thus accounting for multiple head wounds. On May 31, 1994, Milat was formally charged with 7 counts of murder, plus the attack on Paul Onions and various weapons charges. 2 of his rifles, as well as a homemade silencer found by police in his possession, were banned by Australian law. At his 4-month trial in 1996, Milat's attorney tried to undermine the prosecution's case by fingering alternate suspects, including 2 of Milat's own brothers, Richard and Walter. Jurors rejected the ploy, convicting Ivan of all 7 murders on July 27, but presiding Justice David Hunt did tell the court, "In my view, it is inevitable that the prisoner was not alone in that criminal enterprise." In the absence of further indictments, however, Milat was the lone recipient of 6 life sentences, plus an additional 6-year term for the attempted murder of Paul Onions. Milat echoed Justice Hunt's opinion in February 1997 when he appealed his conviction on the unusual grounds that he did not act alone in the murder. No action has been taken to date on that appeal, but Milat was placed under tight security 3 months later after prison guards foiled a meticulously planned escape by Ivan and 3 other inmates. By November 1997, Milat had fired the attorney who fingered his brothers as suspects, representing himself in a new and futile appeal to the New South Wales Supreme Court. Authorities in New South Wales believe that they have only scratched the surface of Milat's homicidus rampage. On March 22, 1998, detectives announced a new investigation into Milat's movements dating back to the late 1970s. According to press reports, he is suspected in the disappearances of 6 Newcastle women and an equal number of tourists, including visitors from Europe and Japan. One rare survivor, a 41-year-old Newcastle resident, has told police she was abducted and raped by Milat in 1978. A second rape victim, attacked the following year, has also been re-interviewed in an effort to link Milat to the crime. The Newcastle disappearances' long-presumed murders date back to 1979 when Milat was employed on a road crew working in the area. To date, no further charges have been filed. Milat appealed against his convictions on the basis that the quality of legal representation he had received was too poor, and therefore constituted a breach of his common law right to legal representation, established in the landmark case of Dietrich versus the Queen. However, Gleason C.J., Kirby P. and Mahoney Yar of the NSW Court of Criminal Appeal held that the right to legal representation did not depend on any level or quality of representation, unless the quality of representation was so low that the accused were no better off with it. The court found that this was not the case, and therefore dismissed the appeal. In 2004, Milat had an application to the High Court heard by Justice McHugh. The orders sought were that Milat be allowed to either attend to make oral submissions in an impending appeal for special leave to the court and that, alternatively, he be allowed to appear via video link. The application was dismissed on the grounds that the issues raised could be adequately addressed by written submission. The grounds of his impending appeal were that the trial judge had erred by allowing the Crown to put a case to the jury unsupported by its own witnesses and had also put forward alternative cases to the jury, one of which had not been argued by the Crown. McHugh J. indicated that this appeal may be defeated because it has been brought out of time. In June 2006, Milat was embroiled in controversy when it was found that he had a television and toaster in his prison cell. Martha Jabber, leader of a group calling itself the Homicide Victims Support Group, described the privileges as an insult to the families of his victims. The privileges were quickly withdrawn after a media campaign stirred up the NSW Parliament and Department of Corrective Services. After his privileges were withdrawn, he again threatened suicide, and was moved to a safe cell and placed under 24-hour video surveillance. Other possible murders. In May 2005, Boris Milat, one of Ivan's older brothers, said in an interview with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Australian Story, "Wherever Ivan has worked, people have disappeared." He also said when asked how many people he thinks Ivan killed, about 20 or so. At present there are about 6 unsolved murder cases where Ivan is a suspect. On the 26th of January 2009, Milat cut off his little finger with a plastic knife, with the intention of mailing the severed digit to the High Court. He was taken to Goulburn Hospital under high security. However, on the 27th of January 2009, Milat was returned to prison after doctors decided surgery to reattach the finger was not possible. This was not the first time Milat had injured himself while in prison. In the past, he swallowed razor blades, staples and other metal objects. Ivan Milat died early Sunday in Long Bay Hospital at the age of 74. The 28th of October 2019 without confessing to 7 murders.